everyone, I wanted to respond to a recent Reuters report highlighting how King George IV personally profited from enslaved labour on the plantations in Grenada during the 1820s. According to research, there's a document showing he received money from the crown-owned estates where enslaved people were forced to work. Now, let me be absolutely and abundantly clear, right? Slavery was absolutely horrific. It was brutal, dehumanising and inexcusable. No one is denying that. It's a stain on human history, one we should study, remember and learn from. But here's where I think we need to step back and look at the bigger picture when it comes to stories like this, especially when they're framed in a modern day context. We cannot and should not hold individuals today responsible for what their ancestors did centuries ago. That includes the royal family, just like it would for anyone else in society. We don't inherit guilt, we don't choose the time we're born into. People alive now had no control over what happened in the 1700s or the 1800s for that matter. And it's wrong to act like they should feel personally accused or condemned for it. Too often we focus on the monarchy and their history in slavery and forget that slavery was a system deeply embedded across all sectors of wealthy society at the time. Even some people part of normal society may have had ancestors that were masters to slaves. And as previously mentioned, the slavery system was across all parts of society at the time, in business, in government, in law enforcement, yet we don't see daily headlines questioning modern politicians or digging into Parliament's legacy with the same intensity. Why is that? So yes, back thousands of years ago, the Crown was involved in colonial systems, but so was the British Parliament, the police, the banks, the churches and countless private citizens. But we're not seeing Reuters publish deep dives into the history of corporate families or leading Labour politicians or legacy institutions. It seems very selective and I think that needs to be called out. We also have to be careful not to distort history by looking at it through a modern lens. Back then, as awful as it sounds to us today, slavery was legal, normalised and widespread across much of the world, not just in Britain. And while it's absolutely something we should criticise today, we also need to understand the historical context properly. In fact, as brutal and inexcusable as slavery was, the reality back then was that many enslaved people were brought into foreign countries with no land, no rights and no money, and no way to support themselves. And as awful as the system was, many were forced into it because there was no other options. It was either work under slavery or face starvation, homelessness or even death. Now, that doesn't make slavery acceptable, not at all. But in that time, in that world, it was sadly the only way some people could survive. They didn't choose slavery freely. They were put in a position where they had no choice. And while most remained trapped in that system, there are historical accounts showing that some did manage to work their way up over time, eventually gaining freedom, citizenship, or in rare cases even becoming wealthy themselves. Again, that doesn't justify the system, but it does show how complex and brutal the reality was back then. Back then, slavery wasn't seen as the evil it is today. It was seen as part of the economic structure, even treated by some as a kind of job, as horrible as it sounds to us today. It's uncomfortable to say, but for some, being enslaved may have been the only path to food, clothing or shelter in a world that offered them nothing else. But here's what really bothers me, how this topic is being presented to the public. It's often not about education or thoughtful reflection. It becomes about shame, guilt-tripping and division. But that's not the way forward. This is where I think schools and public discussions have really let people down. We teach history in isolated timelines, without connecting it to real life. Children grow up knowing slavery happened, but they're not taught how to critically understand history without personalising it or feeling attacked by it. And this brings me to the bigger issue. We cannot keep blaming people today for the actions of those who lived centuries ago. The royal family today should not be held personally accountable for what their ancestors did in the 1700s or the 1800s. The same goes for public figures, celebrities or ordinary citizens, whether in Britain, America or anywhere else. People alive today had no say, no control and no involvement in those systems. Yes, it was horrific that people from different cultures and backgrounds were enslaved. Yes, it should never have happened, but the reality is slavery was the norm in many societies at the time. That doesn't excuse it, it just explains the context. And punishing people now for what their great-great-great-grandparents did is not justice, it's misplaced anger. We need to stop targeting families just because their history is public. If we dug deep into every British family's past, I guarantee you a very large number would have some link to slavery or colonialism. Not because they're evil, but because that's how the world functioned back then. It's not a reflection of who they are today. So, instead of blaming the present for the past, let's learn from it. Let's teach proper history in schools, not watered down versions that skim the surface. Let's help young people understand how the world really worked, how it's changed, and why we should never repeat those mistakes again. That's what real progress looks like, not trying to cancel people for the sins of their ancestors.